Okay, let's give it a minute for people to join. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. We're about to start today's gala webinar. You can see the 2M team is on the starting blocks and ready to tell their wonderful stories about project management of Indigenous languages. So we're just going to wait a minute so that everybody can log in. But in the meantime, I would love for attendees to write in the chat where you are joining us from. And whether you're at the office, home office, at the beach, you tell us. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to start. All right. I think we can start in any case. So welcome to today's Gala webinar. My name is Isabella Massardo. I'm content strategist here at Gala. And as I said, today we have the 2M Language Services team presenting at Gala after a very long time. We have Thea Dieterich, CEO of 2M. Welcome, Thea. And we have Denise Virey, I hope I pronounce it correctly, and we have Leonora Adidi. As you know, the webinar is going to be recorded. I will send a follow-up email to all attendees as soon as the recording is made available on our website. After the presentation, we have some time for Q&A, so please write your questions in the chat as you think of them. And we also welcome any comment and questions during the presentation that you might have, or share your experience or anything. I'm going to go backstage. If you have any technical issues, please write them in the chat and I will help you troubleshoot. But for now, I'm going to give the virtual floor to the 2M teams. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Thea Dieterich, and I'm the founder and CEO of 2M Language Services, an Australian headquartered language service provider and language technology provider. Can I first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where our Brisbane head office is, the Turrbal Jagera people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and their connection to land, sea, culture, and language. Thank you for taking care of this land for over 70,000 years. This land also gave birth to languages. In Australia, there are over 250 Indigenous languages and over 800 different dialects, and we work every day with a range of active Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island Indigenous languages. Languages are living things that connect people to country, culture, and ancestors. And welcome to all of you in the audience today. It's a diverse audience with representatives from large and small language service providers, government organizations, local government councils, academia. Not everyone gets to be here now because of time zones. Many of you will be watching this afterwards. But it's from New York City to Dublin, Canada, across the APAC region, because with this time zone for once, thank you very much, Gala, for accommodating a time zone for Australia, for Oceania, and for the APAC region. So we're all excited to have something in our time zone. Again, many of you will be watching this afterwards because precisely you are now in another time zone, especially I'm thinking of the US, and we're speaking here to you as well. And we can continue the conversation once you've watched this recording, as you can get to talk to us easily with your questions and comments and own sharing and anecdotal evidence and lessons learned via LinkedIn, email, or contact us for a chat. Because this is, after all, our Gala tribe. Gala is the North Star in our industry, covering the pertinent topics. And this sure is one, today's topic. The magic of Gala is also the project managers and all the language managers here in the audience who are usually getting together, exchanging lessons learned, or sometimes it just feels good to hear that others have the same challenges. In Australia, we're far away. It's hard to join other PMs. Even webinars or virtual groups are often European, time zone and US time zone centered, which is prohibitive because it's, our night. So we're, again, yet we have so much to share with our colleagues in Canada, the US, and Latin America across the Indigenous and First Nations topics. And of course, all the other regions and continents in this world where you share similar requirements, interests, and needs. So with this said, I've hogged the floor long enough. This is not a presentation with reading of scripts. This is an authentic conversation and sharing of our findings and experiences, because we're talking to you, our tribe here, right? So we want to make this, I'm repeating what Isabella said, as interactive as possible. So please type your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. We have 15 minutes at the end, but I also encourage you to add any comments, anything, any thoughts, anything else, because if you're thinking of something, chances are it's very interesting to the others. But yeah, enough about me. Presenting with me today are Leonora Adidi and Denise Viray. And let's start with Leonora Adidi. Leonora is a Torres Strait Islander from the Thui Baidam clan of Bamaga and Saibai, and she will introduce herself in a minute. She's a linguist, fluent in Kala, Kabaya, and Yumplatok, a certified provisional interpreter in both languages, and passionate about preserving and revitalizing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and heritage. Leonora has been the chair of NATI's National Indigenous Languages Interpreting Advisory Committee since 2020 and has supported as a mentor at NATI, and we will hear about NATI later, our National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters here in Australia, workshops for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interpreter candidates, and assisted with a test delivery for Yumplatok testing. Throughout her life, Leonora has achieved several significant milestones. She completed a Bachelor of Arts in Language and Linguistics, which has a long-held aspiration fulfilled in her early 40s. She has also collaborated with renowned First Nations arts organizations like Bangara Dance Theatre and the Nai Gai. And please, here's Leonora here to correct my German accent, Gigi, the Northern Thunder, composing songs for their productions and being nominated for a prestigious award. Over to you, Leonora. Over to you. Where do you come to us today from?
Seongafa, everybody. Yes, I'm coming to you from Bamaga. Bamaga is in the Northern Peninsula area in Cape York Peninsula in Queensland, and we're at the most northern tip of Queensland. That's the pointy bit up there. We are the gateway into Torres Strait. So this is where I'm coming from. It's a remote Indigenous community, and where I live. So I'm coming to you from my bedroom. It's 6 p.m.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonora. And we're grateful, and we can go back to the first to the introduction slide, Denise. Thank you. We're very grateful to have you here, Leonora. If you drop out, realities of remote Australia, right? The network could drop. Leonora, when we lose you, you just dial back in and we come back to you. We're very, very grateful to have you. And but before I hand over to Denise, Leonora, apart from coming today from this northern part, which you saw in Queensland, up on the top, what is your? Tell us a little bit. What are you? So you're a translator, you're a dance theater, all kinds of things. Just tell us a couple of things about you.
Yeah, I think I probably, I've reached that age in my life. I'm 63 years old now, and where I just pursue my passions, and which is I'm passionate about our culture, and especially dance and language. Well, language, dance, song, storytelling, and writing, and and art, visual art. So I integrate. I work across those platforms and integrate. So I've been working with musical artists. I mentor them, but I also write songs and record them. And I also manage this dance group, which I'm the spokesperson, and I sing in the dance group. We are a nationally and an international dance group. We do traditional indigenous dance. I also compose songs and also design our regalia. So that's where art comes in. And I'm at the art center also doing visual arts and just painting and using pigments from nature, our natural pigments. And I work and I do interpreting and translating. So that's like my bread and butter. And now and again run language workshops, and I work with NATI, the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, as a mentor in the Indigenous IIP, that's the Indigenous program. Sorry, my mind just went blank. Yeah, so I work as a mentor with interpreters, Indigenous interpreters from all around Australia. I think.
Thank you, Leonora. Thank you. And we will hear of many aspects, but you heard arts, culture, song, music. You can't separate it. It's a very important component. Together with us presenting is Denise Verrey, a First Nations project manager overseeing a team of PMs. Denise has been with us for 3 years. Denise has been in the localization industry for 6 years as a translator, as a project manager, and manages standard migrant language translations for government and corporate clients, and leads localization projects for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island languages. Over to you, Denise. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Tia. Happy to be here. So hi, everyone. I am Denise. I am one of the senior project managers for 2M's translation department. And as Tia said, I work with a lot of standard migrant languages for what we call here in Australia culturally and linguistically diverse communities. But my main focus is on low resource languages and, of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. That means I oversee linguist and vendor relationships, so helping build that connection and trust with our vendors, as well as creating new connections with qualified Indigenous talent across Australia and New Zealand. So I'm really excited to talk about this today. Thanks again for having me, for having us. Thanks, Thea.
Thanks, Denise. Great. Let's quickly go back onwards to 2M, and let's get into it. So if we look at the next slide, so just quickly, Australian headquartered international LSP, as you can see, 350 plus languages, in rare and emerging languages, specialized Pacific Island languages, some Indigenous, also Auslan Australian Sign Language, sometimes they're called low resource languages, these rare and emerging languages. Different countries have different terminologies. We also, as you can see, translation, localization, interpreting, audiovisual localization, we hear about this. It's specifically important here, and language technologies. But yeah, let's go straight on. And here we have there are many Indigenous languages, Torres Strait Island and Aboriginal languages in Australia. We just put in some we regularly work with, but this is just a selection. As you heard before, so Queensland to Torres Strait, for those of you who are new to the Australian geography, Leonora is coming, and I'll pass on to her again in a minute, from Queensland, right? So from the Queensland languages, which is Yumplatok and Kawaya, I believe. Right, Leonora, over to you. So which ones of the top ones you work with, and which ones do you understand?
Okay, well, I work with Kawaya, or KKY as we commonly call it, and Yumplatok, which is the Torres Strait Creole. So those are the two languages that I'm fluent in, and I'm certified in. There is the Kalagawi, that's an umbrella name for the dialects Kekiwa is like the dialect of Kalalagaoya. I can understand those dialects, but I can't interpret because it's just not ethical to do that. And there's Miriam Mir is a totally different language. I don't understand. I may know some words. Yeah, so Wikmunkan is an Aboriginal language of that language at all. And same with Kuyalanji, which is an Aboriginal language, and also I'm not familiar with that language. I mean, you know, even though I know with the communities that speak that language, it's unintelligible to me.
Thank you, Leonora. And maybe
did you get all that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I'd like to add a point on our latest census data, which is actually was collected in 21. You know, it was published in 22. So now we're 24. So, you know, we'll see what the next one shows. But 3.2% of Australia's population identified in that latest census data as being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island origin. That was a 25% increase since 2016, our last census. According to the census, 167 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island languages were spoken at home in 2021, 14% of which were from Arnhem Land and Daly River region, which we saw on the map, which is the top end, which is up north, right? But northwest, not northeast, where Leonora is coming from, while languages in the Torres Strait, where that region, the Queensland top region where Leonora is coming from, alone accounted for 12%, so almost as much as the two others combined. So the diversity is now an integral part of Australia's demography and culture. And while sort of it's understood that multicultural audiences are no longer a separate minor niche, it's also the Indigenous audiences. This has considerable impact on how organizations engage with their stakeholders. To engage, empower, and give equity to your stakeholders, you have to communicate with them. This means you have to give them language access, and not only language access, but often also time-critical language access. And it needs to be the right communication channel, the right tone, the right medium. It might not be written content. We will hear about this shortly, but audio and visual content. But we also have other states. Some of you might know, or from my bio, I was actually over 20 years ago in the Kimberley, the northwestern region of Australia, the manager of the Kimberley Aboriginal Interpreter Service. And I worked with all the Western Australian Kimberley languages, Walmatjari from Fitzroy Crossing, or Kukaja, Kicha, and the Kimberley Creole. So it's very rich, but let's go on to the next slide. And of course, don't forget to ask any questions. Before we go on, just on the language process, Indigenous language interpreting, I did want to really say we also, apart from doing translation, oral translations, because many of the languages which we'll hear are not written about, we also provide interpreting. We also provide on-demand interpreting, which is what we call time-critical language access and health a lot in Indigenous languages. And very, very important there is that only our long-standing partnerships with Indigenous communities support really the delivery of everything, right? And we hear about communities and elders very soon, but this is very different to what we know from the localization space. And when requesting interpreting services, make sure you know the language, the dialect, you know the gender preference, if there's any, for women's health or sexual or reproductive health. This is very, very important. Any additional context for court or medical appointments is very important, and absolutely crucial are names of witnesses, stakeholders, everybody who is going to be in there. So we can rule out conflicts of interest. It happened all the time in my time in the Kimberley, managing the Kimberley Aboriginal Interpreter Service at this time, that we had an interpreter coming just for when actually the interpreter realized who they were going to interpret for. There was there was a conflict. Kinships, they have, you know, very complex kinship and rich kinship system. So there are avoidance relationships. So this is absolutely important. Only this way we can match your language needs and also the subject matter to the most suitable interpreter. But who are actually those clients, Denise? If we look, who are you know, sort of requesting these in especially in the interpreting. As you heard, 2M is it's actually a female interpreter-owned and operated language service provider. And we sit on various panels, government panels, providing interpreter services for public hospitals, healthcare settings, courts, from Commonwealth government ones to Queensland, all of government within states to local government, from from federal courts to peak bodies. And this is also, of course, as you can see, we do for migrant languages and Pacific Island languages, for example, Australian Sign Language as well. That much about interpreting, but I would like to hand over now to Denise for the next slides on the status of Indigenous languages, and of course then to Leonora.
Thank you, Tia. Okay, so hi again, everyone. What we're looking at here is a brief overview of how the Indigenous language scene looks like across Australia. So as you can see here, most of the Indigenous languages are either reawakening, which means the languages in those areas are sleeping. So those are the ones in light green. But it also means that there's a recent uptick in the number of people trying to use it again, or trying to get resources to start using it again. And then unfortunately, we can also see a lot of critical and severely endangered languages across the map. So now that means those languages are, while still being in use, yes, are almost exclusively used by the older generation. And if they are being used, they're not being used as often, or the understanding is really isolated to the older generation. And Leonora, feel free to jump in anytime to give our audience more context. But just on the other hand, yeah, we can also see where the Indigenous languages are staying strong. So you can see that across Western Australia, Queensland, and the top end. So we put this here because we wanted to highlight how important it is to look at the statistics, to know the facts, because one, it helps us facilitate client requests. So we're just going into project management here a little bit. You know, in order to fulfill orders, we need somewhat the full picture, regardless of how limited the data is, so, which is the case for Indigenous languages. So in order to know what we can offer to the clients, what we cannot offer, and really just understand the feasibility of each request. But it's also very important to look at this because as project managers working with the community, we need to understand that, you know, the Indigenous space and really where we can support and give our efforts in preserving the strong languages by facilitating translations and interpreting, and as well as, you know, help renew and revive the ones that are endangered or even at risk. Because I'm sure Leonora would add much more to this, because I wanted to emphasize this, that these translations, these recordings, videos, whatever, these are all resources and assets, data for the communities. And we'll dive deeper on this later, but let me just go ahead and over to the next slide, which gives us an alternative view of the statistics. And just a quick note, according to this 2022 study, communities are actually actively working to reawaken 31 languages. That doesn't sound like a lot, I know, but we do have to start somewhere, right? So pushing out these translations in both written and audio format really plays a part in restoring, preserving these Indigenous languages. And since we started, I could definitely say that we've seen an increase in requests and projects for Indigenous languages. And I'd like to believe that it's because of all the materials that is being pushed out there. So people are now starting to be aware that it's actually possible, you know, to produce translations for Indigenous communities. There are resources and there are providers. Leonora, Thea, feel free to add, but I know you guys have some hands-on and on-the-ground experience. So over to you guys.
Over to you, Leonora. Thank you so much, Denise.
Yep.
Sorry, what was the question for me? Was there a question?
Actually, yeah, sure. Look, first of all, you know, if anything you want to add to what Denise said about these languages, but also about on the topic of the dispossession and revival of Indigenous languages. Do you know what's being done in Queensland? Because one thing is the interpreting the translation, but one is actually, you know, reviving Indigenous languages.
Well, so this is like the underlying big theme across, you know, Indigenous languages, Australia-wide and indeed in Queensland, is our languages are either sleeping, or they are critically endangered, or, you know, I've come across this definition, unsafe, and so when it comes to interpreting and translating, it becomes a factor, because we're not just using these languages that are currently being spoken. We also, these languages are also, there are community that are going on about, you know, preserving and maintaining these languages. And sometimes in the space of translation, when you're producing a document, it becomes an actual resource for language maintenance. And these maintenance, these revitalization and maintenance programs, they happen in communities, in community settings. They happen at school level, so it's been introduced into the schools. Queensland historically has had very little support for Indigenous languages. It was very much English driven, and so a lot of the language loss came, you know, after colonization. So we are now reclaiming those languages. And with my language, 20 years ago, it was, you could say it was a safe language, and but now it's not safe anymore, in that it is critically endangered. In other words, children that are now go at high school age, they are not speaking Kalaukaua, which is a traditional language. But there is the other language that I am certified to interpret, and I also translate, is Yumplatok, which is the Creole. This is a very, very strong language. It is spoken as probably the most speakers of all Indigenous languages. This is a contact language. It's an English-based Creole, and spoken all over Australia by Torres Strait Islanders, and it has the most speakers of all Indigenous languages, and it's very strong, and it just grows every year. And in my community, you know, in the Torres Strait region, you didn't see that on the map. Actually, that map only showed mainland. It didn't show Torres Strait in those dots, you know, that we saw, you know, those colored dots. Torres Strait languages are critically endangered, and yeah. So where was I? I've lost my train of thought.
Thank you, Leonora. Yeah. Thank you, and that's very important. And for our audience, there is a history of why you see this old-fashioned photo on the slide is because fortunately there is a history in some parts, you know, of Australia, of recording of linguists. There are resource centers across Australia. One is, for example, in Halls Creek, back to the Kimberley region, the Kimberley Language Resource Center, where they linguists went out into the community, recorded, archived, and then teaching again, you know, to have those resources. But as we just heard in Queensland, there was a lot less support for that. Critically endangered now, some of Leonora's, you know, languages, and we heard some other key aspect I wanted to highlight that we learned from Leonora. when, and we will see this, so when we record to an oral translation, it's not just content as we know it from our localization. As a matter of fact, in some of our cultures, you know, content comes and goes. It might, sometimes it's even irrelevant 2 minutes later, right? Bang. We heard from Leonora, they don't have the luxury of having these resources. So when something is actually translated, in what format also, it does become a precious resource. Denise had said. So these are aspects that are different, that change the thinking. And if we go on, Denise, to the next slide, and because we'll also look at the challenges. You know, Albert Einstein, right, said that to solve a problem, you know, we can't have the same sort of thinking, you know, we had when we created a problem. So we have to change our thinking. And this is only possible together with our peers, with Leonora, all her colleagues, because Leonora has taught us, you know, a totally different aspect. So if we now go into developing Indigenous language strategies, we can see communication channels and preferences are totally different as well than in migrant languages. Of course, face-to-face is always ideal, but in a country as large as Australia and in many of the other continents, it's not possible. What are the local radio, Indigenous media, social media? We always also have to look at how is content consumed. But NATI is also here important. And we mentioned before that NATI runs the IIP, the Indigenous Interpreting Project, because our national certification body, NATI is committed to supporting more interpreters and translators in achieving certification in Indigenous languages. And Leonora has been instrumental in this as well. So maybe, Leonora, you've been on the board of that, of the the NATI Indigenous group since 2020. Can you tell us a little bit more what has been happening there?
Yes, before I came on the board, I was just a member, and I was just an because I'm an independent interpreter and translator, and I was only a handful, like virtually. This is on what the one hand, like it was less than 5 certified interpreters, and I was one of them. And so we went through, it was actually, a program that was earlier programs that NATI had for Indigenous interpreters, and that's how I got accredited in KKY, in my traditional language, the Kalakalia, and then later on Limsatalk. And so in 20, and I had been working, I was really pushing for Queensland because, like I'd been with 2M, since the early 2000s, I think this is where we met. And even back then, there was just a dearth of interpreters and translators in Queensland, because Queensland government, didn't believe that really and loudly and in very simple words people will understand. That was the stance of the Queensland government. And so when I came on board, my mission was to change that and introduce interpreting in Queensland into interpreting and translation into the government, especially interpreting. Translate, we'd already started the ball rolling with translations, we started working with 2M. So in 2020, there was a vacancy for a chair, a national chair, and that's when I came on board, and I was really pushing that. And one of the things I was pushing was translation, accreditation in translations, because even though we had the IIP and people were getting certified in interpreting, we didn't have certification in translation, even though that was in Queensland. A majority of the work was in translating rather than interpreting, because of the ignorance, or people didn't know that this service would exist, and because people still speak the languages and we still have problems with English, And now, thanks to my parroting and parroting this problem all the time, that give us, we need the skills. We need the skills to to be qualified as translators, not just interpreters, but also translators. I got my, you could say, qualification or knowledge when I was in the linguistics degree. Did one unit in translating back in the early 2000s. 20 years later, I'm now enrolling in a course where I'm going to get a certificate in translating, even though I've got over 20 years experience under my belt. But we have to upgrade our skills all the time. When you get those high government jobs, they're asking you for your CV. They want to see what your qualifications are in translating. And it's the same with the legal profession. When you're working with the high courts, they want to see those qualifications as well. And so this is where we are at the moment. We're trying to develop a course and contextualize it for the Indigenous communities, Indigenous languages.
Thank you, Leonora. Thank you. And I'm going to barge in here. And
okay,
as you can see,
that was a mouthful.
Yes, but very important. We are sometimes losing a little bit of the acoustics. Thanks, audience, for your patience on this. But I am sure you join in with me. So keen to hear from Leonora. That we're super happy to sort of, tolerate a little bit, the weak internet connection, because Leonora has been coming to us from such a remote region. And what we hear is 20 years of experience, right? And only now gaining the actual qualification on this. These are the realities, and of course, some of you in Canada, again in other continents, where you have First Nations, and thanks for going on to the next slide, Denise, which I'm passing over to you. These are realities. Over to Denise now for considerations for these executing the actual projects.
Yeah, thank you, Tia. Thank you, Leonora. I mean, from what we've heard, we've come a long way, definitely, thanks to people like Leonora who are very passionate for moving things along, for the Indigenous communities. But for project management, I think we can still see a lot of challenges and considerations that we do have to take when taking on Indigenous projects. So you can see a list here, but I think it would be easier to explain it by comparing it to standard migrant languages, which in and of itself is that standard. I know it has its own set of challenges. Believe me, I do know standard migrant languages projects can be very challenging. But I think in the grand scheme of things, we can all agree that we almost always know what to do and what to expect. We have a standard turnaround time. Everything is methodical. We know what CAT tools are best to use for each language. We know what technology to use to speed things up. Because projects for standard migrant languages are backed by data, and data means predictability. And that is not something that we can expect when working on Indigenous projects. Unfortunately, we don't have that luxury. There's not enough data. We don't have much. So it can be very, very tricky and very unpredictable. So you can only imagine that on top of all the things that we already have to consider when working on, standard translation projects, we also need to consider, first of all, cultural appropriateness. So for each language, for each community, would the elder of the community even approve the community's involvement in this translation, in this content, in this client, or in this project? So that's a big thing. And then we can also see here verbal versus written. This pertains to content. So are we expected to deliver audio or written work? And for those that are not familiar, most Indigenous languages, as Tay has already said, do not have a written format. So if that's the client's request, we need to know, is that even possible? If it is, would it even work for the target demographic who might not consume written content? And I know, Tia, you told me about a very good and specific example about, understanding the demographic and knowing whether they consume a specific type of content. So feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I can go ahead and proceed to the next slide, which specifies some of these challenges. Would you like to jump into it, or I can?
Yeah, thanks, Denise. Just really briefly, I remember, just to give you examples, real life examples, and Leonora, you might remember this. I mean, you know, probably over 10 years ago, there's a Department of Child Safety, right? Comes and says, here are fact sheets, and we want these translated, written only, of course, into Torres Strait Island languages, right? We, you know, those Meriam Mea and Kalalagaya, Kalakavaya, Yumplatok. And that's what they wanted. And they wanted PDFs, and they embedded them, right? So everything was wrong with this project, everything, right? Because these were for, who was the audience? This was for a younger generation. They were not going to look for embedded PDFs somewhere on a website. This is not how they consume content. Number two, there were linguists, academic linguists involved in some of the translations, but the young generation were actually at that time, and Leonora, remember, we're talking 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8. That was when mobile phones started SMS language. That impacted on the language, the SMS, texting, changed the language. So suddenly young generation spoke a different, you know, language than another generation. Maybe just over, Leonora, do you have just you agree? Are there any comments on why is demographics so important? If your internet holds up, let's see. If not, we're jumping on.
Well, yeah, it is, you know. Okay, yeah, younger generations tend to, you know, they tend to, you know, turn the language into slang. So, and you know, some words into slang languages and slang words. So there's always this conflict between the older generation and the younger generation. But sometimes, you know, if you're writing something and you're writing for a specific audience, you have to speak a language for that particular generation. For instance, you know, some words I was saying to you, I said, look, it's okay if we will use a word, an English word, a lot of English words, jargon words, into the translation. We can explain, we can define the word, and then we'll use, you know, and even with like word like an information or education, everybody knows, regardless of what, you know, everybody knows what that word means in English, and we can use words like that. So when you're writing for a younger generation, it's okay to use a lot of English in it because they will understand it. These people are literate in English to a certain degree. Whereas the older generation, this is when you use a lot of language. You will also use, even when you're using the Creole, for instance, if you're writing a Nuclear talk, use a lot of language words in there so they will understand. You know, so these are the different, you know, the demographics, yeah. And also, the subject matter, you know, especially something like child safety and dealing with the subject of child safety. You know, you have to speak in euphemisms. You know, there are certain words, you know, you just taboo to use, you know, and sometimes it might be okay for younger generations to overlook those taboos, but not the older people. So you got to think about, you know, who is your audience, who are you talking to? Are you talking to men? Are you talking to women? Are you talking to younger, you know, men and women? Yeah.
Thank you, Leonora. Exactly. Moving on, got plenty. Over to you, Denise. What about the challenges?
Yes, so as you can see, there's a lot. I won't go over all of them, but I just wanted to, I think, highlight the ones that we commonly encounter when working with, you know, Indigenous projects. So first one here we see is source content assessment. And as the ones working with both the client and the community, we kind of need to speak their languages. So the client's language, the community's language, and we need to be extra careful with assessing the content so we can communicate any potential roadblocks to the client at the start, at the very start, set the expectations, you know. At the same time, we need to involve the community, know what they have to say about the source and why they're saying it. So again, as Leonora said, is the format feasible? Is the subject matter appropriate for the community? Or even as simple as with the concepts translate into language. So this helps us ensure that the client gets what they have like reached out to us for. At the same time, it helps us ensure that, you know, the community is protected and respected for the source content that we are going to be translating into language. And then we also have here another challenge is the limited number of resources. So if we refer back to the statistics that we showed you earlier, languages are either endangered, at risk of endangerment, or they're not really readily available at any given time. So you can only imagine how this narrows down the already limited talent pool that we have. So as a project manager, this is a resource allocation nightmare, pretty much. You have to be very, very smart and strategic when it comes to mapping out your timelines. And then we also have here quality assurance and technology. I'm going to discuss this because I believe that they go hand in hand. So in an ideal world, we have multiple linguists for all professionals for multiple quality assurance steps, right? And we do try to replicate that when it comes to Indigenous projects. But when that is just simply impossible, the reality is that the best case scenario is to have either one or two professional linguists with years of experience work with the community. So translating and interpreting for Indigenous languages is really a community-driven effort. I'm sure you, Tia, and Leonora, you guys can agree. So we really have to work with, for QA, for quality assurance, really have to work with linguists that we trust and that trust us. Because not everyone is tech savvy, not everyone can use technology, and even if they can, technology is not even really tailored for Indigenous languages, right? CAT tools don't support these languages. So quality assurance needs to be done very practically and very hands-on. We need to do it on paper. We need to do it like really put your hands out there. So you can only imagine that the inability to use technology, all these limitations really impact the time frame, which is another challenge that we put up there. So these things need to be discussed and understood by the client, which is a major factor. I guess in a nutshell, you can all see how these projects really take a lot of time and usually cost a lot. But again, I want to highlight how important this work is, how important it is to keep doing what we do, especially in this space, because these challenges are, I'm sure these challenges are present in standard translation projects as well, especially for low resource and rare and emerging languages. But we have to, again, remember that these translations, these materials that we put out there contribute to the catalog of resources that these languages desperately need. So as project managers, it is our job to just keep pushing these translations and overcome these challenges to provide translations for our clients, but also, again, to provide resources to our resources. So, Tia, Leonora, anything?
Thank you, Denise. And Shannon Brooksy here is saying, absolutely, Denise, client requested Cherokee and Indigenous language in the US, and recruitment of linguists has been incredibly difficult. And again, because we want to make sure we get your questions. So please start, even say if you have a question already, because we've got a few more, a little bit more content for you, but we're happy to take your questions, anytime. Important is what we heard here. Process is not one person. A linguist is not one person. It's a whole team working together to produce one document, one resource. Even if it's only one person, they will go to other people, pull them in for Q&A. So another very important aspect is think about this for your remuneration. All the stakeholders, everybody who, right? And I would like to take this opportunity and quote Leonora, because Leonora has says, elders are the guardians of our knowledge and culture. They are the people we look for validation in, that we're walking the straight and narrow when it comes to culture and community. They are our big bosses, right? Leonora said this, and just before, Jennifer, thank you for your question, which we'll get onto now. But Leonora, right? The elders, why are they so important? Did you want to, Leonora, say anything?
Well, we are governed by yeah. I mean, the thing is that we live in hierarchical communities, and these people, they're the holders of our knowledge. If we want to check anything, if you're working in language and culture or art, anything to do with culture, any knowledge, and you want to get it, we talked about quality assurance. They're the people you go to and you check with them. You always check with them because they will give you the tick of approval. And there's no sacred and there's no secret. Yeah.
Thank you, Leonora. So that gives QA, our LQA, which we know from the localization industry, a whole new matter aspect. Whilst I am replying to Jennifer's question now, maybe Denise, you can just quickly go on to the next slide, which we heard already about the lack of training and certification. This is just, of course, we're going to share the same with the resource. We heard about this, it becomes a resource. If we continue on with the slides, you can see there are some, this one, and if you sort of toggle between the next one, Denise, just visually, we've got Metro South, which is health, right? And then we have the, because this relates a little bit to Jennifer's question, right? Jennifer said, could you speak to the settings where the interpretations are being requested more often, right? Because we had mentioned child services for translation, but yes, Jennifer, you're right, courts. So, for example, in the state of Queensland, we're in all the courts, right? So legal and medical, those two are really the main ones in Queensland, for example, currently. Schools, really interesting. We have in schools more requests for African, low resource, migrant, refugee languages, much more than for Indigenous languages. Why? There are several probably factors, and one important one is awareness, Jennifer. We're still working on it's not only the Vietnamese, and it's not only the Punjabi, right, and the Samoan and the Tongan and the Pacific Island who are entitled to language access, right? But our very own, our very own Australians, right? That has not sort of clicked everywhere yet. So this is a big part. So hence probably not. The communities receiving language services in the private sector, or do the folks who require, this is a question from Jennifer, who require language services in Indigenous languages in Australia, need to bring family members to help them when these services are not available? Leonora, does that happen? Do they bring in family members as interpreters?
Yeah, that does happen, and we're trying to. Look, the only way to stop that, and because there are problems involved, when you start bringing family members in, there are problems with accuracy, and impartiality. But we are trying to stop that. It's through, I guess, information, education, and just letting people know that this, we've got interpreters that are professionally trained, that interpreting does have an ethics code, and to protect the client, all those things, so we have to educate the community as well, plus the and the clients, whether it's a health or medical, with government clients as well. So it's always a worry, when it comes to
Oops, Leonora, we're losing you. We are losing you again.
Have a family member to interpret. Yeah.
We are losing you again, but we did get it. Yes, it does happen, Jennifer. Exactly, and it's about the education going on. I've got the Q&A here. Great questions, by the way. Carmen, Amelie. So Carmen asks, how much detail do you go to when it comes to educating the client about these languages? And all these things we have to take into account when working with them, right? And this is, again, we go back to the praising our project managers here, juggling this dance of the different stakeholders. The client goes and says, this is what I want. What, PDFs embedded? No, this is different for these languages. A lot of detail, Carmen, meetings with them. And, but because often you're dealing with government, you actually, they need approvals for everything, right? So then if we say we are changing, adapting the source, because the source, as you heard from Leonora, wasn't even appropriate because it wasn't for the demographics, it wouldn't be understood. You have to go back, and Denise has to go back and talk to the client and say, this is what we suggest. And then it might take a long time again until they get approval. They might never get approval, no, because they want this. So a lot of detail, a lot of effort, but the team does know how to work, how to present it back to the client. But yeah, a lot of detail. And this is also why it is so time consuming, because precisely of these meetings to even sort of start it. Amelie wants to know, how does 2M concretely build capacity in those hard to source languages? Also important language question, not only for Indigenous, but also for Pacific Island languages, which we do. We, and this is a little bit, well, this is actually closely related to Carmen's last question, are there any standards or education available for new translators and interpreters for these languages to ensure they know what a fair rate or average market rate is for their language? Very good. The answer for those is, of course, manifold, but our 2M Academy has been critical in this. Critical in where we also go into the community, we work with ethnic community councils, if it is migrant languages, with Indigenous organizations, where we invite language speakers, right, of interest, and see, can we train them? Now, there are in Queensland, for example, the Interpreter Training Boost program, which is from the government, which we are delivering with training institutions. In this case, it's TAFE SA, that is delivering the training. We're delivering the work component in those hard to source languages. We are constantly, as Leonora, talking to government and trying to get their support of funding. We're putting in our own funding through the 2M Academy. And back to the rates, right? Yes, this is what the 2M Academy is all about. The 2M Academy is Australia and New Zealand's first free professional development platform for translators and interpreters for all languages. And there are no taboos. There you can talk, what should I charge? What is this? The remuneration I refer to is not only for the translators. We cannot go on and pick people's brain for free. Impossible. So in terms of the conclusions here, right? Shift in thinking, some things are similar with refugee or hard to source languages and Indigenous, right? Concepts can be completely different. But important is, whilst we are at 2M always leveraging people, innovation and technology, right? Make no mistake, innovation, technology is not innovation. Innovation is how you think. And we can't do it without people. People and the community, elders and the community are the most important asset here to make sure the art involved is correct, right? To ensure the tone is correct. And there we have to make sure everybody is remunerated in that whole chain. We heard from Leonora, who said it's never one person. They go. It's their Q&A, it's their QA, their quality assurance to go there. Denise, over to you. Recommendations. What are a few over to you as your last word, because I know that our time is up.
Yeah, thank you, Tia. I think you've perfectly summarized everything that we wanted to say. So we just wanted to emphasize that, translating into interpreting into Indigenous languages is really a community-driven effort. Like, you're not just involving one linguist, you're involving the community really. So again, highlight on the remuneration there. And yeah, I think you've summed it up pretty well. Thank you, Tia.
Thank you, Leonora. And last, I know that we're on time here, but thank you so much for joining. Leonora, a last comment from you. What do you want the international audience to know?
Well, what I'd like you to know is that, you know, we are working very hard to increase the number of interpreters and translators in our communities, and also help with the revival and maintenance efforts of our languages.
Thank you so very much. I am very happy to have welcomed you all. We look forward to being in touch. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates. Follow us here. But over to you. Thank you, Gala, for having us, and thank you, Leonora and Denise.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, all the attendees. And
Thank you.
the 2M team. Leonora, it's been an honor listening to you. And thank you, Denise, and thank you, Tia, or Thea, sorry, I should say that. And for those of you who are interested in the topic of Indigenous languages, this is not going to be the only webinar. We're going to continue this conversation, of course, with the 2M team, but also next week, we're going to have a Gala Roadshow in New York, where language access is the topic. And one of the speakers is going to be Ross Perlin, who wrote the book Language City and tried to map all the indigenous language speakers in New York. And then next week, on Thursday, we have a free webinar titled The Next Billion Users, Technology, Barriers, Solution, and Opportunities. And of course, you're all invited. And let's keep this conversation going. So thank you so much, Thea and team, for starting this very important topic. When I close the webinar, you'll see a link that takes you to a post-webinar survey. Please take 10 seconds to fill it in. Let us know how you like the content, but most importantly, let us know what are the topics you would like to see featured in the very near future. And for now, I'm going to say have a great day, have a great evening, and hope to see you soon at another Gala event. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.